June 24th. Ichen Sambai Ishisu. The Bannockburn isn't flowing with water anymore. It's paved solid with the corpses of English aristocracy. The stream is so completely choked with the bodies of armored knights and drowned horses that a grown man can literally walk from one bank to the other without getting his feet wet. You aren't stepping on mud or rocks. You're stepping on the dead faces of earls, barons, and the finest heavy cavalry in all of Europe. This isn't a battle by any normal definition. This is a traffic jam of death. This is a catastrophic failure of logistics and arrogance, where 20,000 men have been systematically herded into a carefully designed kill box and slaughtered by a force barely 1/3 their size. This is industrial-scale murder, disguised as medieval warfare. History tells us the Scots won the Battle of Bannockburn through raw courage and bravery, through heart and determination and the indomitable Scottish spirit. That is a romantic lie designed to make us feel good. They won because Robert the Bruce turned the landscape itself into a weapon of mass destruction. They won through cold calculation, brutal engineering, and the systematic exploitation of English arrogance. The truth is so much more interesting than the myth. But before we dive deeper into how the impossible became reality, make sure you're subscribed to Maproom Battles. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. This isn't a story about brave hearts. It's a story about smart brains. Hit that subscribe button now, because by the end of this, you'll understand that the greatest weapon in history isn't courage, it's geometry. To understand how we arrived at this nightmare river of corpses, we have to strip away all the romantic Hollywood myths that have corrupted our understanding. When we think of medieval battles, movies have trained us to imagine chaotic, honorable duels where the good guys win because they have more heart and determination. But war in the 14th century was absolutely not about heart or moral superiority. It was about cold mathematics, brutal physics, and the systematic application of terror. And by every calculated metric that mattered, by every logical analysis, what happened at Bannockburn should have been completely impossible. The English army that marched north into Scotland that summer was not just a military force. It was a moving city of death. It was the Death Star of the Middle Ages made flesh and steel, led by King Edward II of England. This terrifying force consisted of over 2,000 heavy cavalry, the medieval equivalent of modern main battle tanks, and somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 infantry. Archers, depending on which historical source you trust. These were professional killers encased in plate armor, riding destrier war horses, bred specifically over generations to trample human beings into paste. The supply train alone supporting this army was reportedly 20 miles long, laden with gold, wine, luxury foods, and even portable royal wardrobes. King Edward was so supremely confident of inevitable victory that he literally packed for a celebration rather than for a fight. He was planning the victory feast before the battle even started. Opposing this overwhelming juggernaut was Robert the Bruce, the self-proclaimed King of Scots, who most of Europe still considered a rebel and a traitor. His force was laughable in comparison to the English might. He had perhaps 6,000 men at most, mostly poorly equipped spearmen, with just a handful of light cavalry. They had no heavy armor worth mentioning. They had no endless supply wagons. They were exhausted from years of guerrilla warfare and living in the wilderness. If you were a betting man in 1314, putting money on the Scots wasn't a gamble. It was throwing your money away as charity. The English outnumbered them at least 3-1, potentially 4-1. But numbers written on a page do not account for the terrain you're fighting on. And they certainly do not account for the power of pure desperation combined with tactical genius. Robert the Bruce knew with absolute certainty that he could not defeat the English in an open field battle. To attempt such a thing would be suicide. So he made a decision he simply wouldn't. He would change the map itself. The strategic prize at the absolute center of this collision was Stirling Castle. It is impossible to overstate the critical importance of this fortress to Scotland's survival. It was the key to the entire kingdom. Whoever held Stirling Castle held the gateway between the lowlands and the highlands. It was the throat of Scotland. And Edward II was marching north to squeeze that throat shut forever. But there was a catch to this situation. A bizarre bureaucratic technicality that actually triggered this entire bloodbath. A year prior, Robert the Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, had made what he thought was a clever gentleman's agreement with the English commander of the castle. The deal was diplomatically simple. If the English army didn't arrive to relieve the castle by Midsummer's Day, 1314, the castle would surrender peacefully to the Scots without a fight. It was meant to be a clever diplomatic squeeze play that would avoid bloodshed, but it backfired spectacularly in ways Edward Bruce couldn't have predicted. It gave the King of England a specific deadline. It gave him an exact date and an exact location where he absolutely had to show up. For a guerrilla fighter like Robert the Bruce, whose entire military strategy relied on hitting the enemy and running, on vanishing into the mist and the mountains, this was an absolute nightmare. His survival for years had depended on being a ghost, an enemy you couldn't pin down. Now his brother's foolish diplomatic deal had forced him to become a wall. He had to stand and fight a pitched battle against the mightiest army in all of Christendom, on a day and at a location chosen by the enemy. When Robert the Bruce heard about this agreement, he was reportedly absolutely furious, likely wanting to strangle his brother with his bare hands. He knew from bitter experience that facing English heavy cavalry on open ground was a guaranteed death sentence. The English knights were an unstoppable kinetic force of nature. A full charge of 2,000 heavy horses generated enough raw physical force to shatter any infantry formation known to exist. The ground would literally shake beneath your feet. The noise would be deafening, and the psychological impact alone caused most medieval armies to break and run in terror before physical contact was even made. So Robert the Bruce had to make an impossible choice. He could retreat, letting Stirling Castle remain in English hands and losing all his credibility as King of Scots. Or he could stand his ground and risk the total annihilation of Scotland's entire fighting power in a single afternoon. He chose to stand. But he wasn't going to play by English rules. If the English were bringing a hammer to smash him, Robert the Bruce wasn't going to be the nail. He was going to be the anvil that broke the hammer. He arrived at the battlefield weeks early, which was absolutely critical. He personally walked every foot of the ground near the new park, a royal hunting reserve south of Stirling Castle. He studied the marshy streams of the Bannockburn. He examined the dense woods. He analyzed the slopes and the drainage. And slowly, he began to visualize something unprecedented, a kill box designed specifically to slaughter cavalry. This is where the story fundamentally shifts from being a tale of romantic bravery to becoming a masterclass in combat engineering and tactical psychology. Robert the Bruce realized something profound. The English Army's greatest strength, its massive size, and its devastating heavy cavalry, was also potentially its greatest weakness, if exploited correctly. They were slow and ponderous. They needed vast amounts of open space to maneuver their formations. And most importantly, they were supremely arrogant. They expected the Scots to run away in terror, as they always had. Robert the Bruce made the calculated decision to use that fatal arrogance against them. He would bait the trap with his own apparent weakness. Could you have that kind of cold nerve? Knowing one mistake means your nation dies. Robert the Bruce began to prepare the ground systematically, transforming the natural landscape itself into a weapon designed specifically to kill English cavalry. This wasn't just about digging a few trenches or ditches. This was an industrial-scale excavation project designed to funnel 20,000 men into a meat grinder of Bruce's design. As the sun rose on the days leading up to the battle, the Scottish soldiers weren't just sharpening spears or practicing formations. They were digging constantly. We often picture medieval soldiers solely as warriors in armor. But here at Bannockburn, they were laborers, engaged in back-breaking construction work. They dug hundreds upon hundreds of small, cunningly concealed pits known as pots. These weren't large, obvious moats that the enemy could see from a distance. They were precise, honeycomb-patterned traps, each about a foot wide and carefully hidden with sticks and grass. Inside each carefully positioned pit, they placed a sharpened wooden stake pointing upward at a calculated angle. The design was cruel, specific, and brilliant. It wasn't primarily meant to kill a man directly. It was designed specifically to snap the leg of a charging warhorse. Robert the Bruce understood physics and biology better than most military commanders of his era. He knew that a charging knight on a horse is essentially a medieval tank, nearly unstoppable. But a knight thrown to the ground and trapped under a screaming, thrashing 1,200-pound animal, that knight is just a man in a metal can waiting to be opened with a dagger. The horse does half the work of killing him. The atmosphere in the Scottish camp during these preparation days must have been absolutely suffocating with tension. Every man there knew what was coming from the south. They could probably feel the vibrations of the English march through the ground long before they could see the enemy banners on the horizon. The English army approaching was a genuine spectacle of wealth and military power. Their armor was so polished and shone so brightly in the summer sun that contemporary chroniclers wrote that it looked like the land itself was on fire with reflected light. They brought with them not just weapons and soldiers, but the full crushing psychological weight of the English crown and centuries of military dominance. They were coming to crush a rebellion, to hang traitors, and to restore proper order to a rebellious province. They did not expect a real fight. They expected a rout and easy victory. But as the English vanguard approached the Bannockburn on June 23rd, they found something they didn't expect at all. The Scots weren't hiding in the woods like guerrillas. They weren't running for the hills. They were standing in military formation out in the open. It must have looked pathetic to the experienced English commanders, a few thousand poorly equipped spearmen in rough wool tunics, standing against the glimmering tide of English chivalry and steel. But this visual disparity was actually part of Robert the Bruce's trap. He wanted them to see weakness. He needed them to feel confident. He was deliberately dangling the bait, knowing that English knights driven by their rigid code of chivalry and their insatiable lust for personal glory, wouldn't be able to resist charging. And he was absolutely right about human nature. The stage was perfectly set for one of the most shocking military upsets in all of human history. But before the main armies would clash in full force, a single moment of individual violence would set the psychological tone for everything that followed. A moment that felt more like a scripted movie scene than real history, where a king would gamble his life and his entire nation's future on a single swing of a battle axe. Are you ready to witness it? It's the afternoon of June 23rd. Ichen Sanbai Yishisu. The main English army is still struggling slowly through the narrow medieval roads to the south. But the eager vanguard has arrived ahead of schedule. These are the young, glory-hungry knights, the aggressive ones who couldn't wait for the main force. Led by the Earls of Gloucester and Hereford, they ride out confidently into the new park, fully expecting to flush out a few terrified peasant skirmishers. Instead, they find the entire Scottish army waiting in disciplined circular formations. And right there, brazenly riding out in front of his defensive lines, is the King of Scots himself. Robert the Bruce is not hiding behind his troops. He's wearing a distinctive gold circlet around his helmet, a gleaming target that screams, "I am the king. Come kill me if you can." But there's an obvious problem that every English knight immediately notices. Robert the Bruce isn't mounted on a massive destrier warhorse like a proper king should be. He's riding a small, nimble palfrey, essentially a pony meant for travel and scouting, not for combat. To an English knight trained from childhood in proper warfare, this looks like a joke. It looks like a gift from God himself. Enter Sir Henry de Bohun. He's the nephew of the powerful Earl of Hereford. Young, ambitious, heavily armored, and riding a destrier warhorse that weighs literally as much as a small car. He spots the gold crown on Bruce's helmet. He sees the ridiculously small horse. In his mind, the entire Scottish War of Independence is already over. He genuinely believes he's about to end the rebellion with a single perfect lance thrust and become the greatest hero in English history. He lowers his lance with practiced precision, spurs his monster of a horse, and charges at full speed. This is the moment where history holds its breath. By all military logic and experience, Robert the Bruce should immediately retreat behind his wall of protective spears. A man on a pony does not joust with a heavy cavalryman in full armor. It's not courage. It's suicide. It's basic physics. If de Bohun's lance connects solidly, the kinetic energy will punch straight through Bruce's lighter armor and lift him out of the saddle like a rag doll being thrown by a child. His generals, watching from the Scottish lines, are screaming internally for him to run to safety. But Robert the Bruce doesn't move an inch. He sits completely motionless on his small horse, calmly watching the English knight thunder toward him like an avalanche of steel and death. The ground shakes beneath them. The distance closes with terrifying speed. 80 yards, 40 yards, 10 yards. At the very last possible second, just as the steel tip of the lance is literally about to pierce his chest and end Scotland's hope, Bruce pulls his reins hard. He doesn't panic or flail. He pivots with perfect timing. His small, agile horse sidesteps the charging destrier with the grace of a matador dodging a bull. De Bohun misses completely. His tremendous momentum carries him helplessly past the Scottish king, exposing his flank and the back of his helmeted head. In that split second of vulnerability, Robert the Bruce stands up in his stirrups. He's wielding a battle axe in his right hand. He doesn't swing it wildly like an amateur. He brings it down with the precision of an experienced woodcutter splitting a log. All his strength and weight behind it. The axe strikes Henry de Bohun's helmet with devastating force. The impact is so immense that it doesn't just dent the steel or knock him unconscious. It cleaves completely through the helmet and splits the knight's skull from crown to chin like a melon. The wooden handle of Bruce's axe shatters from the sheer force of impact. Henry de Bohun is dead before his body hits the ground. Could you have held your nerve like that? Waiting until the last second, most men would have run. The silence that follows this shocking kill must have been absolutely deafening. Broken only by the heavy thud of de Bohun's armored body and the sudden explosive cheers erupting from the Scottish lines. This wasn't just a successful joust or a lucky kill. This was a psychological nuclear bomb detonated in front of both armies. The English vanguard freezes in their saddles. They just watched their champion, fully armored, mounted on the best warhorse money could buy, trained since childhood in combat, get casually deleted by a man on a pony with a hand axe. The invincibility of the English knight, the foundation of their entire military system, is shattered in a single instant. Robert the Bruce calmly returns to his lines, composed as if nothing significant happened. His commanders rush to him, absolutely furious that he risked the entire future of Scotland on a moment of personal bravado. They scold him harshly for his recklessness. In Bruce's response to their anger, he looks down at the splintered wood in his hand, shrugs casually, and simply says, "I have broken my good axe." This nonchalance is the final nail in the coffin of English morale for the day. The psychological impact is devastating. The English vanguard, rattled and effectively leaderless after watching their champion die, retreats in confusion, but they don't leave the battlefield entirely. They pull back to the wet, marshy ground known as the Carse to camp uncomfortably for the night. They're angry at the humiliation. They're confused by the unexpected resistance. And most dangerously, they're thirsty for revenge. They begin to drink heavily from their wine supplies. Meanwhile, in the Scottish camp, just a mile away, the mood is grimly focused. Robert the Bruce knows the real test is coming tomorrow. He's won the crucial opening move. He's delivered a devastating blow to English confidence. But the full crushing weight of Edward's army, 20,000 angry, humiliated men, is about to fall on him at dawn. And that night, something happens that will change everything. A traitor crosses the lines in darkness with information that transforms Robert the Bruce's defensive plan into an offensive masterstroke. As night falls on June 23rd, the two armies are separated by less than a mile of ground, but they exist in two completely different realities. The Scots are camped in the relatively dry, sheltered woods of the new park. They're eating simple oatmeal, praying to God and various saints, and resting as best they can. They're mentally and physically ready for what's coming. The English, however, are experiencing something closer to hell on earth. Having been checked by the Scottish traps and difficult terrain during the day's maneuvering, they have been forced to move down onto the Carse of Balquidderrock. It sounds like a fantasy location from a fairy tale, but in brutal reality, it's a tidal flat, a marshy, mosquito-infested bog bounded by the Bannockburn on one side and the river Forth on the other. Imagine 20,000 men and thousands of horses trying to sleep in a swamp. The ground is so soft and waterlogged that the horses sink up to their fetlocks with every step. The men cannot lie down without being soaked in cold, stinking mud. There's no space to properly pitch tents. They're packed shoulder to shoulder, cold, wet, and increasingly terrified. The morale shock of seeing their champion killed so easily by what they considered a peasant king is festering like an infected wound in their minds. Discipline begins to break down. The English supply wagons issue wine instead of water, and a drunken, nervous hum rises from the dark swamp. They're not an army resting confidently for battle. They're a disorganized mob trapped in a bog, wondering if they've made a terrible mistake. And into this chaos, a shadow slips away. Someone is about to change history. In the middle of this chaotic, miserable night, a lone shadow slips quietly away from the English camp and heads toward the Scottish lines through the darkness. This is Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish knight who has been fighting for the English crown. But the sight of the day's events has fundamentally changed his mind about which side deserves to win. He's brought before Robert the Bruce in the Scottish camp and delivers a piece of intelligence that literally changes history. He tells Bruce directly, "Sir, if you wish to take Scotland, the time is now. The English have completely lost heart. They're disorganized, cramped, and terrified." Seton confirms what Bruce already suspects from his own observations. The English are trapped in terrible ground. Their massive numbers are actually choking them rather than helping them. They're packed so tightly in the narrow neck of land between the rivers that they cannot properly deploy their complex formations. Bruce realizes with growing excitement that the English have made a catastrophic error in logistics. They have essentially parked a Ferrari in a tiny closet. They have overwhelming power, but absolutely no room to effectively use it. Robert the Bruce makes a decision that defies all medieval military convention and common sense. Usually in this era, the smaller army stays on the defensive and waits to be attacked. But Bruce decides that at first light tomorrow, he will not wait passively to be attacked. He will attack first. He orders his men to prepare for an aggressive dawn assault using a specialized formation that will become legendary, the Schiltron. To understand why the next day becomes a systematic slaughter rather than a battle, you have to understand the brilliant mechanics of the Schiltron. This wasn't just a random crowd of men holding sharp sticks and hoping for the best. It was a highly disciplined mobile fortress built from human bodies and steel. Imagine a giant bristling hedgehog made of 500 men arranged in perfect formation. They stand in a circular or oval shape, ranks deep. The outer ranks kneel down, planting the butts of their 12-foot pikes firmly into the ground, angling the sharp steel tips outward at precisely the height of a horse's chest. The ranks standing behind them hold their pikes level at the height of a mounted rider's face. Crucially, Robert the Bruce had spent years training these men to move while maintaining this formation. Unlike the static phalanxes of ancient Greece and Rome that could only hold ground, Bruce's Schiltrons could actually advance across the battlefield while keeping their deadly formation intact. They were offensive steamrollers made of flesh and steel. The physics of the Schiltron are brutally simple and devastatingly effective. It denies enemy cavalry any surface area to make contact. A horse, no matter how well trained or brave, will absolutely not charge into a solid wall of steel points. Its survival instincts will make it shy away, swerve, or stop completely. By advancing these mobile forests of spears into the cramped English position, Bruce intends to systematically compress the English army until they literally cannot lift their arms to fight. He's going to use the English army's own massive size to crush it to death from the inside. It's brilliant, brutal, and requires perfect discipline to execute. But can it actually work against the finest army in Europe? Dawn breaks on June 24th. Ichen Sambaishasi. The sun rises over a battlefield that defies all logic and expectation. The English army, stiff, cold, and hungover from a sleepless night in the marsh, looks up to see something impossible. The Scots are not retreating into the safety of the woods. They're not holding their ground defensively. They're marching out aggressively. 3 massive divisions of Skiltrons emerge from the tree line like slow-moving mountains of steel, advancing into the open plain in perfect formation. King Edward II watches this from his saddle, completely bewildered by what he's seeing. He turns to his veteran commander, Sir Ingram de Umfraville, and asks a question that reveals just how disconnected from reality he is. Will yonder Scots fight at that exact moment? The entire Scottish army halts as one. Thousands of men drop to their knees simultaneously in the grass. To King Edward, this looks exactly like surrender. He actually laughs out loud, exclaiming, "They kneel. They ask for mercy." Umfraville, who knows the Scots far better than his king, looks at the kneeling men with growing dread. He replies carefully, "They ask for mercy, sire, but not from you. They ask it of God. For these men will conquer or die." As the Scots rise from their prayers, the psychological trap snaps shut like a bear trap on a leg. The English vanguard, led by the Earl of Gloucester, makes a fatal error, driven by pure ego and wounded pride. The Earl had been publicly accused of cowardice by the king the night before during an argument. Desperate to prove his loyalty and courage, he doesn't wait for his archers to get into position. He doesn't wait for infantry support. He orders an immediate heavy cavalry charge right now. This is the collision of 2 eras. 500 of the finest knights in Europe against a moving wall of pikes held by common men. The physics are absolutely horrific. As the English horses thunder uphill toward the Scottish lines, the knights expect the peasants to scatter in terror, as they always have. They don't scatter. The Skiltrons lock into place. The front ranks kneel. The rear ranks brace. The impact sound is described by contemporary chroniclers as a massive crash, like a building collapsing. But it isn't the sound of the Scottish lines breaking. It's the sound of English cavalry shattering against an immovable object. The Earl of Gloucester is thrown violently from his horse and hacked to pieces instantly by Scottish spears. Scores of other knights are impaled on the 12-foot spears before they can even swing their swords. Their horses, maddened by pain, rear up and thrash wildly, crushing their own riders and breaking the momentum of the charge behind them. The forest of spears holds firm against the impact. And then it does something that must have been terrifying to witness. It starts to walk forward slowly. Imagine the horror for the English infantry positioned behind the cavalry. They're stuck in a bottleneck, bordered by the Bannockburn on one side and the Pellstream burn on the other. They can't move left. They can't move right. And now a wall of sharp steel is pushing their own panicked cavalry backward directly into them. This is the beginning of what will become known as the Crush. The English army is so large that it becomes its own prison. The men in the back are still pushing forward eagerly, completely unaware of the slaughter happening at the front. The men at the front are desperately trying to retreat to escape the advancing spears. The pressure builds steadily. Ribs begin to crack. Men are lifted off their feet by the sheer density of the crowd. They aren't dying from sword strokes yet. They're dying from compression asphyxiation. The Scots have successfully engineered a human trash compactor, and the English army is the garbage being crushed. But where are the English archers? They could change everything. At this point in the battle, any student of military history should be screaming a desperate question. Where are the English archers? The English longbow is arguably the most devastating weapon of the age. Just 14 years earlier, at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, the English had completely destroyed William Wallace's Skiltron formations simply by standing back at a safe distance and raining arrows until the Scottish formations disintegrated like wet paper. A schiltron is an effective fortress against cavalry charges. Absolutely. But against arrow fire, it's just a large, densely packed stationary target where every arrow is guaranteed to hit someone. The English commanders understand this perfectly. They're not stupid or incompetent. They're just physically cramped by the terrain Bruce chose, desperate to break the deadly stalemate. The English commanders finally managed to maneuver a large body of Welsh archers out to the flank of the Scottish lines. They scramble up a steep slope on the Scottish left wing. This is the moment of maximum danger for Robert the Bruce. If these archers are allowed to draw their bows and fire, the Scottish lines will collapse within minutes under the arrow storm. The entire battle will turn. The archers plant their feet on the slope, nock their arrows, draw their powerful bows, and prepare to turn the Scottish victory into a massacre. But Robert the Bruce has a memory like a steel trap. He was personally there at Falkirk 14 years ago. He saw William Wallace's men die because they had no cavalry to protect them from the archers. He has spent 14 long years preparing for this exact second. Just as the first devastating volley is about to fly, a sudden thunder of hooves erupts from the Scottish rear. It's Sir Robert Keith, the Marshal of Scotland. He leads a small but elite force of 500 light cavalry. They've been waiting patiently in reserve, hidden from view, with only one specific job: kill the archers before they can fire. The timing is surgically precise. Archers are absolutely deadly at a distance, but they're completely helpless in close quarters combat. They wear no armor to allow freedom of movement. They carry only small knives for personal defense. And because the English commanders rushed them into position so quickly, they haven't had time to plant their defensive stakes that would protect them from cavalry. Keith's cavalry hits the archers from the side like a hammer striking glass. It isn't a battle, it's a systematic execution. The archers are cut down before they can loose a single effective volley. The survivors panic completely. And here is where the disaster multiplies exponentially. The terrified archers don't run away from the battle toward safety. They run back into it, directly into their own army. Screaming, terrified Welsh archers flee headlong into the packed ranks of their own infantry. The chaos becomes absolute. The English army is now effectively fighting itself. The infantry, already squeezed dangerously by the advancing Scottish spears, are now being trampled by their own retreating archers who are trying to escape Keith's cavalry. Communication breaks down entirely across the battlefield. The rear sections of the massive English army still think they're winning and keep pushing forward. The front is being systematically crushed and is trying to retreat. The middle is a swirling nightmare of confusion where no one knows what's happening. With the threat of the longbow completely removed, the Scottish schiltrons are now effectively invincible. They have no natural predators left on this battlefield. Robert the Bruce sees the confusion spreading through the English ranks like a plague and orders his entire line to advance aggressively. The hedgehog is no longer just defending ground. It's hunting. The Scots push forward in a disciplined rhythm of stabbing steel. Shouting their war cry, on them, they fail. The English knights, the proudest warriors in Europe, are trapped in an absolute nightmare. They're pinned so tightly against one another that they literally cannot lift their weapons to strike. Men are fainting from the heat and pressure, only to be trampled into the mud by their own comrades. The ground is turning into a slurry of blood and marsh water. The Battle of Bannockburn has ceased to be a contest of skill. It's become a contest of physics, and the English army is running out of room to exist. By mid-morning, the Battle of Bannockburn has completely ceased to be a fight. It has become a crushing machine, operating with mechanical precision. The Scottish schiltrons are no longer just holding their line defensively. They're advancing step by bloody step, systematically compressing the massive English army into a space that is physically too small to contain it. The English are backed up against the steep, muddy banks of the Bannockburn. They're trapped between an advancing wall of Scottish spears and a deep stream. This is where the true horror of medieval combat reveals itself in all its brutality. It isn't the sword or the spear that kills the most men here at Bannockburn. It's the pressure itself. As the Scots push forward relentlessly, the English rear ranks instinctively, push backward to avoid the water. The result is a terrifying phenomenon that modern doctors call crush asphyxiation. Thousands of men are pressed together so tightly that their lungs physically cannot expand enough to take a breath. They're suffocating while standing upright. Knights in heavy plate armor are lifted completely off their feet by the sheer density of the crowd. Suspended upright, helpless, dying of suffocation while still technically standing. Those who fall to the ground do not get back up. They are trampled into the mud by thousands of feet belonging to their own desperate comrades. The ground is transforming into a slippery crimson slush of blood, dirt, and marsh water. The noise is utterly indescribable, the clashing of steel on steel, the screams of wounded horses, and the desperate cries of men being crushed to death creates a wall of sound so loud it drowns out all commands. The Bannockburn itself, the stream that borders the battlefield, begins to fulfill the gruesome destiny we saw at the very beginning of this story. As the English line finally begins to buckle under the relentless Scottish pressure, men and horses are forced backward into the ravine. The banks are steep and slippery with mud. Heavily armored knights slide helplessly down into the water, landing on top of one another. They drown in just inches of water, weighed down by 60 pounds of steel, pinned by the bodies of their friends. The stream becomes a dam of corpses. For the Scottish soldiers pushing forward, this is a moment of savage vindication. For years they've been hunted, starved, and butchered by these same English lords who treated them like animals. Now the roles are completely reversed. They shout their war cry and stab their pikes into the chaotic mass. They're not fighting individual duels anymore. They're working like a thresher machine, harvesting the English army row by row. King Edward II, watching helplessly from the rear, is witnessing something impossible. His invincible war machine is eating itself. His commanders are dead. His archers are scattered. His infantry is suffocating. The greatest army in all of Christendom is dissolving into a panic-stricken mob. But the final blow, the stroke that will turn this defeat into a legendary rout, hasn't even landed yet. It's waiting just over the hill in the form of an army that doesn't actually exist. The English army is broken, compressed, and dying. But they're not yet running in full retreat. The sheer mass of men packed together means that even as they die, they're physically stuck in place by the bodies around them. The battle hangs by a thread. The Scots are exhausted. They've been fighting for hours against a force 3 times their size. If the English rear guard makes one final coordinated push, the weight of numbers could still potentially turn the tide. But then something happens on the skyline. Something that Robert the Bruce arguably could never have planned, even in his wildest dreams. Yet it delivers the final, fatal blow to English psychology. High above the battlefield on the crest of Gillies Hill, a new formation suddenly appears. To the blood-soaked, terrified English soldiers in the valley below, it looks like a massive reinforcement army has arrived. Thousands of fresh troops are marching over the ridge, waving banners and shouting war cries that echo down into the valley. They bang weapons against shields, creating a terrifying cacophony. The English commanders look up in complete despair. They think we cannot even defeat the Scots in front of us. How can we possibly fight a second army? Panic, which has been bubbling under the surface all morning, finally explodes throughout the English ranks. The cry goes up, "They have fresh help, run!" Run for your lives. But here's the incredible twist. That fresh army on the hill, it isn't an army at all. It's the small folk. These are the camp followers of the Scottish army, the cooks, the wagon drivers, the blacksmiths, the women, and the children. They've been watching the battle from safety all morning, seeing their countrymen finally winning after years of defeat. They've grabbed whatever they could find, blankets tied to poles to look like battle flags, pots and pans to bang together like drums, pitchforks and cooking ladles instead of spears. They're rushing down the hill not to fight, but to plunder the English camp or simply to celebrate victory. But in the heat and haze of battle, fear acts as a powerful hallucinogen that transforms perception. The English don't see washwomen and cooks. They see the angel of death coming for them. The illusion is perfect. The psychological dam breaks completely. English resistance instantly evaporates like morning mist. This is the exact moment the battle ends and the hunt begins. The rear ranks of the English army, who haven't even drawn their swords yet, turn and flee in panic. But remember the terrain. They're boxed in. As they turn to run, they collide with the confused men behind them. The military formation disintegrates into a chaotic stampede. The Scots, sensing the total collapse, drop their long pikes. They draw their swords and axes. The discipline of the Skiltron is replaced by the fury of the chase. They surge forward into the dissolving English mass. What follows is not war. It's a massacre. The English are fleeing in every direction, some toward the castle, some toward the river, some straight into the deadly marshes. The small folk rush down from the hill to join the slaughter, proving that in war, perception can be just as deadly as reality itself. The mightiest army in Europe has been routed by a psychological trick involving bedsheets and kitchen implements. In the chaos of the collapsing English line, a frantic struggle is happening around King Edward II. This isn't a struggle to capture him. It's a desperate struggle to save him from his own incompetence. Are you still with me? Because this gets even worse for England. As the small folk swarm down the hill and the English formation completely shatters, the king's bodyguards realize with horror that the battle is totally lost. The Earl of Pembroke literally grabs the reins of the king's horse and physically drags him away from the fighting. King Edward II, dazed and humiliated, is forced to turn his back on the slaughter of his own men and flee. But amidst this shameful royal retreat, one man makes a completely different choice that will echo through history. Riding alongside the king's party is Sir Giles de Argentan. You likely haven't heard his name, but in 1314, he was an absolute superstar. He was widely considered the third best knight in all of Europe, a celebrity athlete of the medieval world, famous from France to the Holy Land for his skill and honor in tournaments. As the royal party breaks free from the carnage and heads towards safety, Argentan suddenly reins in his horse. He looks at the fleeing king, then back at the Scottish lines where his comrades are dying. He turns to King Edward and delivers one of the most devastating resignation letters in military history. He says calmly, "Sire, your safety was committed to me. You're now safely on your way to escape, but I'm not accustomed to fleeing from any battle, nor shall I start now. I commend you to God." With those final words, Sir Giles de Argentan spurs his horse. He doesn't ride south towards safety and survival. He rides north, straight back into the heart of the Scottish Schiltrons. It's a deliberate suicide run. He charges into the mass of spears, shouting his war cry, cutting down Scots until he is inevitably pulled from his horse and killed. He chooses death over the dishonor of survival and retreat. It's the last gasp of the age of chivalry dying in the mud of Bannockburn. Meanwhile, King Edward II is experiencing a humiliation beyond imagination. He rides frantically to the gates of Stirling Castle, the very fortress he marched north to save. He screams to be let inside to safety, but the constable of the castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, refuses to open the gates. It's a moment of supreme irony. Mowbray calmly explains that under the terms of the agreement, the castle must surrender to the Scots, and if the king enters, he will become a prisoner of war. The King of England is rejected by his own castle, defeated and effectively homeless. Edward is forced to flee south, chased relentlessly by Sir James Douglas. Known as the Black Douglas, the pursuit is relentless and humiliating. Douglas has only 60 horsemen, not enough to attack the king's larger escort directly, so he simply shadows them, riding close enough to constantly harass them, denying them rest or food. For miles, the King of England is hunted like a fox across the countryside until he finally reaches the safety of a ship waiting at Dunbar. He escapes with his life, but he leaves behind his honor, his army, and even the crown jewels. Back on the battlefield, the slaughter continues until sunset. The Bannockburn is so completely full of armored bodies that the Scots can cross it without wetting their feet, bringing our story full circle to the gruesome image we started with. But as the screams finally fade and the systematic looting begins, The Scots realize they haven't just won a battle. They've captured the equivalent of a small nation's GDP. The English baggage train, miles of wagons filled with gold, silver, royal vestments, and fine wine is now theirs. In a single afternoon, the poorest nation in Europe has become wealthy. But would this victory last? Or would England return for revenge? You might reasonably think that after losing 20,000 men, his honor, and the crown jewels, King Edward II would admit defeat and recognize Scottish independence. He did not. For 14 long, bitter years after Bannockburn, the English king stubbornly refused to recognize Robert the Bruce as the legitimate king of Scots. The war dragged on in endless raids and skirmishes across the border. The Pope, heavily influenced by English gold and political pressure, kept Robert the Bruce excommunicated from the church. Technically, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, the hero of Bannockburn was a heathen outcast who would burn in hell. But the Scots had learned something profound at Bannockburn that changed their entire worldview. They had learned that the impossible was actually possible. If they could defeat the mightiest army in Europe through intelligence and preparation, they could certainly take on the Pope and the entire church establishment. In 1320, 6 years after the battle, the Scottish barons gathered at Arbroath Abbey to draft a letter to Pope John XXIII. The document, known as the Declaration of Arbroath, is arguably the most important piece of parchment in Scottish history. But it's far more than just a Scottish document. It's a revolutionary manifesto that planted the seeds for modern democracy and human rights. In a world of absolute monarchs ruling by supposed divine right, the Scots wrote something genuinely radical and dangerous. They told the Pope directly that Robert the Bruce was their king only because he was good at the job. They wrote explicitly that if Bruce ever tried to sell them out to the English or betray Scotland's independence, they would immediately fire him and pick someone else to be king. This was completely unheard of in medieval political theory. Kings were chosen by God, not by the people. Kings ruled until death. Yet here were the Scots declaring that the king worked for them, not the other way around. They were inverting the entire feudal pyramid. The most famous passage of this letter still sends chills down the spine of anyone who values liberty. It reads, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riche, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." This powerful sentiment, that freedom is a natural right worth dying for, traveled across the centuries. Thomas Jefferson reportedly studied this text carefully. You can hear the direct echoes of Arbroath in the American Declaration of Independence written 450 years later. The blood spilled in the muddy waters of the Bannockburn literally watered the tree of liberty that would bloom in Philadelphia. Finally, in 1328, the inevitable happened. Edward II was gone, deposed by his own wife and her lover, then murdered in a manner too gruesome to describe in detail. His son Edward III finally signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, formally recognizing Scotland as an independent nation and Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. The impossible victory was complete and official. The ragged guerrilla army of 1,314 had forced the superpower of the age to bend the knee. But for Robert the Bruce personally, the victory was bittersweet. He had spent his entire adult life sleeping in caves, fighting in mud, and carrying the crushing weight of a nation on his shoulders. By the time peace finally came, he was dying, likely of leprosy. He had won his crown, but he wouldn't live long to wear it in peace. Yet he died, knowing he had done the one thing he promised. He had kept Scotland free. Today, if you visit the site of the Battle of Bannockburn, you won't find a bridge of corpses or a river of blood. You'll find a quiet, wind-swept field just outside the modern housing estates of Stirling. The Bannockburn flows peacefully. Children play in the nearby parks. Life goes on. Standing guard over this historical silence is a massive bronze statue of Robert the Bruce. He's mounted on his warhorse, axe raised in his hand, frozen in that eternal moment of defiance. The statue is impressive and dramatic, but looking at it, it's far too easy to fall back into the trap of romanticism, to think that the Scots won simply because they were braver, or because they had hearts of fire and unbreakable will. That does a profound disservice to what actually happened here. It reduces a masterpiece of military engineering to a fairy tale. The real lesson of Bannockburn is not about passion or emotion. It's about cold, hard intellect, combined with preparation. Robert the Bruce didn't defeat Edward II because he shouted louder or believed harder. He defeated him because he understood the environment better than his enemy. He turned the geography of Scotland into a weapon. He used the hidden pots to neutralize English horsepower. He used the mobile skiltrons to neutralize English numerical superiority. He used the small folk to weaponize fear and psychological warfare. He used every advantage he could find or create. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare that is still studied in military academies around the world today. The Battle of Bannockburn teaches us something profound about conflict that applies far beyond medieval battlefields. It teaches us that when David fights Goliath, David doesn't win by playing Goliath's game with Goliath's rules. David wins by changing the rules entirely and forcing Goliath to play a game he can't win. The Battle of Bannockburn remains the single most significant military victory in all of Scottish history. It didn't just secure temporary independence. It forged a national identity built on the revolutionary idea that sovereignty and freedom belong to the people, not to kings or nobles. The Declaration of Arbroath, written 6 years later, is the spiritual grandfather of every democracy that exists in the world today. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by a challenge that seems too big to handle, whether it's a massive corporation, a powerful government, or just the difficult circumstances of your own life, remember the Bannockburn. Remember that the biggest, most expensive war machine in medieval history was systematically dismantled by a few thousand starving men who knew exactly where to dig holes and when to stand their ground. Sometimes you don't need a bigger army or more money. You just need to understand the terrain better, prepare more carefully, and wait patiently for the giant to step into the trap you've prepared. Intelligence defeats strength. Preparation defeats size. And a small group of determined people who refuse to quit can change the entire world. But let's talk about something the history books usually gloss over. What happened to the people involved after the battle ended? The immediate aftermath of Bannockburn shaped Scotland for generations. For the common Scottish soldiers who fought in those schiltrons, life after victory was complicated. Yes, they'd won their freedom, and gained access to captured English wealth. But many were wounded, traumatized, and had lost friends and family in the fighting. The captured English nobles were held for ransom, creating a massive influx of wealth into Scotland. Some ransoms were so high they bankrupted English families for generations. For example, the Earl of Hereford was eventually exchanged for Robert the Bruce's wife, daughter, and sister, who had been held prisoner by the English for 8 years in terrible conditions. For King Edward II, Bannockburn was the beginning of the end. The defeat destroyed his credibility and authority. His barons lost faith in his leadership. His wife Isabella eventually betrayed him with her lover Roger Mortimer. In 1327, he was forced to abdicate, and shortly after, he died in captivity under suspicious circumstances. The official story says natural causes. The unofficial story involves a red-hot poker. For Robert the Bruce, victory came at enormous personal cost. He spent his final years in constant pain from what was probably leprosy. He knew he was dying and became obsessed with fulfilling a promise he'd made during his darkest days of guerrilla warfare to go on crusade to Jerusalem and fight for God. When he died in 1329, his heart was removed from his body and placed in a silver casket. He had requested that his most trusted knight, Sir James Douglas, carry his heart on crusade to the Holy Land. Douglas did attempt this journey, but he was killed fighting Moors in Spain. Legend says that in his final moments, surrounded by enemies, Douglas threw the casket containing Bruce's heart ahead of him into the enemy lines and shouted, "Lead on, brave heart, as thou wert wont to do, and Douglas will follow thee or die." The heart was eventually recovered and buried at Melrose Abbey in Scotland, while Bruce's body was entombed at Dunfermline Abbey. In 1996, during excavations, archaeologists discovered a lead container with a heart inside. DNA testing is still ongoing to confirm if it's actually Robert the Bruce's heart, but many believe it is. For Scotland, as a nation, Bannockburn created a sense of identity that transcended tribal loyalties. Before 1314, Scotland was more of a geographical expression than a unified nation. The Highlands and Lowlands were almost separate countries. After Bannockburn, there was a shared experience, a shared victory, a shared story of overcoming impossible odds. That matters more than people realize. National identity is built from these shared stories. But let's not romanticize too much. Scotland's independence lasted only until 1707, when the Act of Union created Great Britain. However, the spirit of Bannockburn, the idea that a small nation can resist a larger power, that freedom matters more than comfort, that never died. It influenced the Scottish Enlightenment, inspired revolutions around the world, and still shapes Scottish identity today. So what's the real takeaway from all this? What does a 700-year-old battle teach us about the world we live in now? The lesson of Bannockburn isn't that violence solves problems. It's not that war is glorious. The lesson is much more subtle and much more powerful. It's about preparation, adaptation, and understanding your environment better than your opponent understands it. Robert the Bruce had every reason to give up. He was excommunicated by the church. He was hunted by the English. He was betrayed by Scottish nobles. He spent years hiding in caves. At one point, according to legend, he watched a spider trying to spin a web, failing 6 times. but succeeding on the seventh attempt. Whether that story is true or not, it captures something essential about Bruce's character: relentless determination, combined with the willingness to learn from failure and adapt. The modern world faces challenges that seem insurmountable: climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, technological disruption. It's easy to feel like the English army, massive, powerful, but somehow stuck in the wrong terrain, unable to effectively use our advantages. But Bannockburn teaches us that apparent weakness can become strength if you're smart about it. The Scots were poor, so they couldn't afford to fight the English way. That forced them to innovate. They couldn't win cavalry battles, so they invented a way to make cavalry irrelevant. They didn't have enough men, so they used terrain and psychology to multiply their effectiveness. In business, in technology, in social movements, the same principle applies. Constraints breed innovation. Having fewer resources than your opponent isn't always a disadvantage if it forces you to think differently. Think about how many technological revolutions came from small teams working with limited resources, defeating established giants. Think about how many social movements succeeded because they understood psychology and organization better than their more powerful opponents. The specifics change, but the pattern remains. Thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles for this deep dive into the brutal engineering of medieval warfare and the birth of democratic ideals. If you enjoyed discovering how intelligence and preparation defeated overwhelming force, please help us fight our own battle against the algorithm by hitting that like button and subscribing. I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Robert the Bruce's tactics could work in modern warfare? Or has technology made terrain less important? And what challenge in your own life feels like facing the English army? Huge and overwhelming. Let's discuss how the principles of Bannockburn might apply. History isn't just about the past. It's a manual for the future. And the manual says understand your terrain. Prepare thoroughly. Exploit your enemy's assumptions. And never give up. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you're told. And remember that the impossible is just the possible, waiting for someone smart enough to figure out how.